Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. This is Corey from CoreyBakerFilmmaker.com, and I just saw The Last Dance, a 10-part documentary event directed by Jason Hehir. So first, before we get too deep, I've integrated some new things into the reviews here. I have new camera, I have new graphics that you might be seeing below, and just trying to up the game a little bit wherever I can. And would love to hear what people think about it. So leave me a comment below if you're enjoying the new and improved experience, and anything I can do to change it from here. On to The Last Dance. I've been watching for the last 5 weeks here, like I think most sports fans in America have been, because there is a serious lack of real sports going on for us to pay attention to. So right now we were all focused very heavily on Jordan again, like it was the mid to late 90s. And it was great. The basis behind why this documentary sort of happened is that there was an agreement that they were going to do behind the scenes of the Chicago Bulls during the last season of their second three-peat. So they won 3 championships in a row. Jordan left for a couple years, and then they won 3 championships again. This is all the footage from the third championship the second time around, the last championship that the Bulls have together. And along the way, we sort of cut between these two timelines that are happening concurrently. So the first one is what's happening in the 1998 season as they go through the season, as they go towards the playoffs, as they go to the championship. That's all separated throughout all 10 parts. But at the same time, they're sort of doing a career retrospective of Jordan up until this point as well, where we're looking at him, like coming into the league and getting injured and stuff like that as we go along with the sort of 1998 timeline, which is happening at the same time. And just as a thing for potential documentary directors who might be listening to this, I think that this ability to have both a narrow and wide subject as the subject of your documentary is a very interesting idea, and something that I haven't seen done so much like this in the past. More or less, it's either sort of retrospective or it's a very narrow field of focus on one particular incident. So either you would make a documentary about the Jordan flu game, or you would make a documentary about Michael Jordan's whole career. Very rarely have I can think of, have I seen a documentary that is able to match both very well without any kind of problems, and a tip of the hat to the filmmakers for that one. While I'm busy giving out tips of hats, I think that the entire crew, regardless of, like the whole post crew specifically, did an incredible job given the circumstances of what we're dealing with here. So, number one, a 10-part documentary is outrageously difficult just to put together as it is. There's so much footage, there's so many people who have to go through and master things, and then you're putting things together so that you can make the documentary, and then things have to get cut and things have to be moved around, and it's way more complex than a regular movie is, because usually with a regular movie you're shooting for, call it a month. You're shooting for a month, and then you have a month's worth of footage that you give to editorial, and they know all the scenes and roughly how they're going to be put together. I mean, there's some moving around that happens once the movie gets to post, but it's not the same as having 82 plus games of an NBA season that you have to cut down, as well as all this archival footage. It's a humongous task. And this thing got moved up because of coronavirus. There was an obvious opening in ESPN's calendar. And I think when they announced that they were going to be moving up the showing of this documentary, they weren't done with the last 2 parts. And to be able to come together as a team and edit those last 2 parts and have them out for fans to be able to enjoy while we're all at home trying to get through this period, it's way more impressive than it sounds. And editing in particular, being a director of something and editing is something that you really want to be like in the room for. So doing these sort of things on Zoom and all that sort of stuff is not quite the same as being in the room with the guy editing. But I think that it turned out incredible. I thought they did a very good job all the way through. It had very even pacing, and it was just very, you kept watching. Like as soon as 2 episodes were done in a night, you were waiting for the third. It'll be a great thing to stream when it eventually finds its way to Netflix, where it'll be doing its next run after it's done with ESPN. One thing I will say about this movie, and it sort of falls in line with any movie that's being made about some public figure who hasn't done something wrong. If you do something wrong, there's going to be a documentary eventually about it. And I'm sure somebody is currently putting together the Cosby Harvey Weinstein documentary. And there's nothing really either one of those two can say, because, you know, they've been found guilty, and there's going to be enough to be able to just make the documentary the way they want to. And it'll be investigative and everything like that. But one of the concerns that had been a part of documentary film prior to, say, Michael Moore, where documentaries sort of became more public and more politicized, was the angle on a documentary. Like, where, you know, where are the people coming from? Why do they want to shoot this thing? Why do they want to put some sunshine on this story? And I don't think that it's unusual that you would want to tell sort of career retrospective of Jordan when you have this footage and you have the ability to interview him and sort of get his takes on it. It makes it, you know, very compelling. But, you know, we're also in this age where documentaries are being made more and more as sort of a publicity thing, it feels like. And I'm not trying to, like, you know, point fingers at particular things, but, you know, for instance, I watched the Hillary documentary on Hulu. It was another 5-part documentary series. And, you know, it was well done, like the craftsmanship involved with making sure that, you know, the image looked good and they had good editorial and all that sort of stuff. But this was a documentary that was never going to examine Hillary in a way that made people who were not apt to like her feel like they got enough of the story. It was very, oh, we're going to talk about the bad things, but we're not going to get too deep into the bad things, because this is mostly about how amazing Hillary is as a person. And those documentaries are becoming more and more prevalent. And I think specifically sort of in the news recently, we had this pandemic documentary that was getting shared all over the place, and you can listen to me and Rob talk about that on the Anthem podcast if you want to get more into it. But documentaries are just getting more and more molded by the viewpoint of the person who's telling it, and it can be hard to tell a very investigative story where you try and find it as you go along, like a lot of documentaries used to do. That being said, I think that this documentary was overwhelmingly fair, and I think that they touched on things that people wondered about Jordan, things that were good, things that were bad. They touched on, you know, other various sources of drama or interest within the Chicago Bulls during the time that Jordan was there. I feel like Jordan had a lot of opportunity to sort of Bigfoot anything if he wanted to. He was the one who decided when the footage got out there. 2 of his closest business associates are executive producers on this movie. It wouldn't have happened if Jordan didn't give it its okay. And you can sort of see that in, like, you know, the interviews with Jordan. Like, it has his blessing. So, and more importantly, as somebody who grew up with Michael Jordan, like, he was the biggest athlete in the world when I was a kid, and I was a huge basketball fan as a kid too. And Michael Jordan was unlike anything else. And I feel like if you had just asked me, Corey, speak for the next 10 hours about Michael Jordan, I would come up with pretty much everything that they discussed in the documentary. I don't feel like there's anything that's missing per se. I feel like in the interest of telling the most compelling version of the story, they did it. That being said, if there were a couple things that I think I wouldn't mind hearing a little bit more about. Number one, the slam dunk contest. When Jordan took off from the foul line, it seemed like it went beyond sports in a way. Like, even though it wasn't even a sporting event, it was just the slam dunk contest. It's not like it was an actual game. it transformed people. It made people completely aware of Jordan and what he was capable of. And I just think that if they had spent a little bit of time talking about that, that might have been nice. They also talked about, Jordan as, the brand and going to Nike, and, they talked about that early on, but I don't think they really ever sort of got to the depths of Jordan as sort of this merchandising business brand machine. Because, think about it this way. So last year, Michael Jordan made $140 million from Nike and from the Jordan brand. The highest paid basketball player on like an endorsement deal other than that was LeBron James with $30 million. So Michael Jordan, despite being retired for 2 decades now, is still making way more money from his shoes than any player who's currently playing, including the best player who's played the game since he was in the league. Another thing that would have been nice to touch on is that they spend so much time talking about how Michael's parents were with him throughout the whole thing. There's the story where Michael's mom is talking about, I got to go give Nike a chance. There's obviously a huge thing about his father being murdered and how important his father was to him, and the new father figure, the security, who essentially became the father in absentia for Jordan post his father's murder. I thought that was all really nice, and they touched on it very well. I do wish there was just a little bit more about Michael and his kids and his family, because a lot of what people have talked about with Michael is that he wasn't necessarily the best father or the most available father, or it didn't seem like he had the same sort of relationship with his kids that his father had with him. And, there's a lot of different reasons for why that may be. But I feel like it could have been touched on a little bit, but then where do you fit it in? That's part of the problem. A lot of these things are points that I think would be nice to have in the story, and maybe were things that were left on the cutting room floor, but I just don't know where you would necessarily fit that in. In addition, the documentary just ends when, the season's over, everyone goes their separate ways. They sort of talk about that off-season, that first off-season post, but they never really get into the lives of the people after the fact that much. There's like little tiny blurbs like, Rodman released, Pippen traded, Phil Jackson goes on to coach the Lakers, that sort of thing. But, Jordan's second act as a front office person, as an owner, has been just as fascinating and just as inspiring as anything he was doing when he was actually playing the game. He was able to translate his ability into a front office position with the Wizards. And, he eventually came back to play for the Wizards. These were things that were not necessarily available to every single athlete. Magic Johnson, more recently, had sort of been able to make the leap from player to an ownership position, and he was a minority owner of the Lakers. He had various times has been in charge of hiring, coaches and players and everything like that as well, in sort of a general manager capacity. But nobody has really been able to do this quite the same way that Jordan did. And that is very clear when he goes on to eventually buy the Charlotte Bobcats, later to be the Charlotte Hornets again. He buys the franchise on a valuation of $275 million. He puts up $30 million cash. The organization is now worth $1.25 billion or something like that, according to Forbes. Compare that to very shortly thereafter, Steve Ballmer, former CEO of Microsoft, who buys the Los Angeles Clippers, spends $2 billion to be able to get them away from Donald Sterling. And to think that Jordan has this business prowess that has been able to not just be about the basketball, which is the thing he's most well known for, being the greatest basketball player in the world, but also an incredible ability to make a brand that feels cool and hip, even though he's not in the league anymore, and still being able to find ways to sort of stretch that competitiveness into other fields. If there was one thing that I feel like the filmmakers might have benefited from, if some things that I think might have made this a more compelling version of the documentary that they ended up doing. I don't feel like it makes enough steps necessarily to reach out to the person who doesn't know anything about basketball. Now, I watched basketball during this time. I watched pretty much all these games that we're talking about during the course of the documentary. But I still sort of found myself pausing and explaining things to people, other people who are not as familiar with what was going on in the NBA at the time. And more than anything, I guess if I could tell something to people who are listening to this review right now, maybe people who want to go watch the Jordan doc, I would say that the NBA, more than any other sport, has been broken down into eras that are shorter and more fast coming than other sports. If you think about baseball, there was like the dead ball era, and then there was a steroid era, and beyond that, beyond those points, the game more or less was the same. There were changes in rules, there were changes in players and cities and yada yada, but more or less the game sort of remained the same for a 70-year stretch there. There was the integration of baseball, which made a humongous difference, but like the actual way in which the game was played didn't change that much. Basketball, on the other hand, changes almost on the decade. It's very common to see somebody talk about like the 80s era basketball or the 90s era basketball and sort of talking about it as like if it's a different sport, because in a way it kind of is. People like Jordan were never getting called for traveling or anything like that used to happen to players back in the day, because the NBA realized that it was more valuable for their product to have the most important superstars on the court for as long as possible and not getting fouled out of games and stuff like that. I mean, specifically, they talk about the triangle offense a little bit. Like, they break it down, and I thought they did a really wonderful job of explaining to a layman sort of how this works, how it involves moving the ball around to get the best shot. And I think that if there was just a little bit more of that sort of on the sport generally, then it would make the accomplishments of Jordan feel so much more incredible. If I told you that Jordan had ran 1,000 miles at a 4-minute mile, then you would be like, oh my God, that's the most incredible athlete I've ever heard of, because I can't run a 4-minute mile and I can't run one of them. That puts into context how incredible his leaps are beyond others. And I just feel like by not sort of setting the stage for people who are watching the documentary more, it makes it a little bit harder for people to understand what the greatness is that they're looking at. One last point. I feel like the only person who really didn't get their fair shake on this whole thing was Jerry Krause. And I understand why, because he was sort of seen as the bad guy throughout this whole thing. He's the reason why the Bulls didn't get back together and try for a 7th ring in 99. He was the one talking about how we're going to have to rebuild, how we're going to have to get rid of Phil Jackson. Jerry Krause is also not alive, so everyone else gets an opportunity to sort of speak about what they were thinking and how they played through this time, and Jerry Krause doesn't really have the chance to defend himself. I would like to say, just for the record, for somebody who was watching at the time, there was clearly a chance to be able to bring the band back together and try and win again. But, Jerry probably, if he was in this documentary, would be able to talk specifically about how the money and the structure of an NBA team works. And I mean, like, specifically, most great teams in NBA history have sort of the same pieces involved. Like, they could be different positions, but more or less you need 2 superstars, maybe even 3 superstars. And you need, a couple defensive guys. You need a couple people who can, back at this time, you needed at least one person who was just a 3-point specialist. That was Steve Kerr. He was just a guy who came off the bench, shot, 5 threes a game and tried to get them a little bit more into the game. It's completely different than how the game is played today with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson and the Warriors and everything like that. Also a Steve Kerr team. But again, I mean, I feel like Jerry sort of is painted as more of a bad guy just because he can't defend himself. But that, if people don't know sort of structurally how this works, it's hard to understand his side of the argument. They never make the point to say that I guess very much at the very end, Jerry Reinsdorf is explaining how everyone who is a free agent is going to cost way more money than they can afford. Pippen's going to cost $70 million to re-sign. You got to sign Jordan again. He offered to let Phil Jackson come back and coach again. But I mean, it was just, there was too much tension at this point. It wasn't going to work that way. Two last super quick points. Number one, while I find that this movie was fair and did enough to sort of talk about the good and the bad of Jordan and the Bulls, I feel like that there were little opportunities or little moments throughout this thing where it felt a little bit like the history is written by the winners kind of thing. For instance, Phil Jackson, when he became the coach, it's sort of portrayed more in the documentary as he was an assistant coach. He was willing to run the triangle offense. He had expressed an ability to run the triangle offense, and that's why he was promoted to coach. There's a bit more reporting on what was happening back in the day where Phil was more actively backstabbing and trying to put himself in a position, maneuvering himself into a position where the Bulls would end up going with him. And I feel like that's a different story than sort of what they portray in the movie. And it's not that Phil wasn't the right coach for the job and that Phil didn't do everything he needed to do to be able to make the Bulls successful. It's just that these little points, while they might muddy the narrative waters of the movie, are a little bit more indicative of the depth that people have individually as the characters that were portrayed in real life and therefore in the documentary. Last thing on this one, and it's just a minor nitpick, and I was fine with it because it happened so infrequently, but there were a couple moments where the action on the court and the way that it was edited together felt more like a documentary that you would get like sort of like Hard Knocks or like a Road to the Winter Classic type of thing where we're showing the background scenes. But every once in a while when we're showing the actual action on the court, it's the slow motion, 60 frames a second, the ball going up in the air and heading towards the basket and the announcers being overlaid over top of it and everything like that. And it's fine. I don't have a problem with the style. It just feels a little bit more like you're watching SportsCenter in a way than it is that you're watching the documentary. Sometimes it felt a little jarring. And again, it's not like a huge deal. It's just something that I would have been a little bit more cognizant of, I think. But again, the incredible amount of work that went into just getting this thing pushed up and released when it was, I really have no complaints about anything as far as the movie is going. It's just a tiny little suggestion, if nothing else. Normally, it would be time for the leaderboard, but unfortunately, it's a documentary, so I don't do leaderboards. I would like to restate for people who weren't here for the last documentary that I did a review on. I don't think it's fair because, I mean, so much of how compelling a documentary is can depend on the subject and how much somebody personally feels a connection to the subject. I, as a child of the 80s, am very well connected to Michael Jordan and his legacy, and I would be more inclined to give it a higher score because I am interested in the topic. That doesn't mean that the filmmaking is necessarily better than the documentary about macrame, which I don't care about at all. It's not the same thing as trying to make a narrative story, and therefore I don't feel like it's fair to give it a like numerical review or rating. That being said, I will say that it's very worth watching, especially if you were a basketball fan or a child of the 90s like me. And I think that while a knowledge of basketball might benefit you in understanding the movie better, I don't think it's a necessary prerequisite. Basketball is a simple enough sport where you realize pretty quickly what essentially is going on without having to know what a charge is or what a technical foul is or any of these more in-depth parts of the game. You can just sort of watch this and know that the goal is to put baskets in opposing hoops. And that's more or less what you need to know. your experience is heightened if you know more, but it is certainly not a requirement. Anyway, that's it from me. If you want more, you can go to my website, CoreyBakerFilmmaker.com, Facebook.com/CoreyBakerFilm, and at LegendsCB5 on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. If you want me to watch something, make a review, please let me know below. I'm glad that I'm finally able to make a review about a more current piece of work. I'm very happy about that. But I'm going to be coming back here real soon with another classic review, sort of helping feed the inspiration for my new project, and I want you to all feel like you're coming along on the journey for that. In the meantime, if you wouldn't mind liking this video, sharing it, subscribing, turning on notifications on the channel, I appreciate every single one of those things. And don't forget that if you can't actually sit down and watch the video, maybe you want to take it on the go with you, I do it as a podcast as well. Anchor.fm/Corey Baker. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you don't mind, I have to annoy everybody in the house. I'm going to change all the lights to red. I'm going to put on Sirius, and I'm going to start doing the From University of North Carolina, number 23, Michael Jordan.